It's the great New Zealand paradox that this country produces more food per head of population, has a greater number of livestock for every person living here than any country anywhere on Earth. And yet New Zealanders don't live in the country, they live in towns, and they always have. And this is where it all began. New Zealand's largest, busiest, and what was almost its first town began right here at the foot of Shortland Street in Auckland. The Auckland Star is printed almost on the very spot where the first Aucklanders stepped ashore. And the Waitemata lapped the beach just round that corner there in what they called Commercial Bay. Waiting for those first Aucklanders when they brought the trappings of government with them from the earlier capital at Russell in the Bay of Island was the man who was to become Auckland's best-known businessman. He sold the new arrivals bracken for their bedding from a tent he pitched here where Shortland Street meets Queen Street. That enterprising immigrant was only 22, yet before he'd left Scotland, he'd already taken his medical degree at Edinburgh. His name was John Logan Campbell. But the only doctoring that Dr. Campbell ever did was when he worked his passage to Sydney as the ship's surgeon. His real interest was exploring strange places. John Logan Campbell wasn't the first man to sail into the Waitemata, but he was the first man to envisage the possibility of a large European-style city on its shores. He'd already spent a year on the Coromandel Peninsula. There he'd lived with the Maoris and learned their language. When he sailed into the Waitemata, he realized that the Tamaki Isthmus was the only possible site for the capital of the colony that was in the process of being established. He was so certain about it that he tried to buy what is now Mount Hobson and the slopes of Remuera, Auckland's most valuable residential suburb. But the local Maoris turned him down. The best he could do was to buy this island, Motorcar, from Maoris he knew very much better than Ngāti Tamatera. Today it's called Brown's Island after Campbell's partner William Brown, a lawyer from Dundee. They set up a pig farm here with an eye to supplying pork to the settlers they knew would soon come to Auckland. Campbell left the pigs in Brown's charge and pitched a tent on the beach at the foot of what became Queen Street. That was in 1840. Next year, the official survey was complete and Brown and Campbell bought 2 sections in Shortland Street and set up shop as general traders. Their business was largely with the Maoris who knew Campbell and trusted him. Soon, Brown and Campbell were doing so well they published their own newspaper with their own advertisements in it. They sold everything from horseshoes to hogsheads of brandy. In fact, very few commodities passed across Auckland's wharves that Campbell wasn't involved in. He quickly diversified his interests. He exported kauri gum and kauri timber. Perhaps most important, though, in the long run, he brewed beer. Though the capital was soon shifted to Wellington, the merchants of Auckland had learned a lesson they've never forgotten, that financing trade is just as important as wielding power in Parliament. As a city built on trade and commerce, Auckland suffered more than most urban centres during the long depression of the 1880s and 1890s. Many of its merchant princes went to the wall. Only John Logan Campbell's canny good sense enabled him to survive, although, as he freely admitted, he was at his wits' end for several years. But survive he did. By 1900, Dr. Campbell was the undisputed father of Auckland. He was already 83 and might reasonably have expected to slip quietly into retirement. But the next year, he was invited to serve briefly as mayor of Auckland when the city received the most distinguished visitors in its 60-year history. The Duke and Duchess of Cornwall, the future King George V and Queen Mary. They stayed here at what was Government House, Auckland. And from that balcony up there, they watched whilst Auckland celebrated. That royal visit of 1901 marks the end of one era in the pattern of growth of New Zealand towns and the beginning of another. At the turn of the century, travel between the four main centres was slow and difficult, even for royalty. The royal party travelled either by sea or, where railways existed, by special train. Within the towns themselves, they travelled by coach. Their entourage followed on horseback. And the people who came in their thousands to see them came either in their own trap or by horse tram or on Shanks's pony. But very soon after the Duke and Duchess returned to London, a new mode of urban transport clattered into the lives of New Zealanders and cluttered the streets of their largest towns. This is the contraption that changed New Zealand towns. The electric tram replaced the tram drawn by horses after the turn of the century. And then you could travel 3 or 4 times as far in the same time as you could before on foot or even on a horse tram. In Logan Campbell's time, men had walked to work. For the next 50 years, they took the tram. More than anything else, it was the electric tram that determined the size and shape of the towns and cities they lived in. Where trams went, suburbs followed. New Zealanders enjoyed rising standards of living and had work to do. They built bungalows bunched together on small sections. Trams took them almost to their door. The steady growth of the suburbs of New Zealand's largest cities after World War I is impossible to imagine without trams. For those of us who travel daily by tram, the terminus names have a nostalgic ring. Trams took people to work and to shop and to the pictures at night, children to school, whole families to the beach. Dad on Saturday to the football match and to the races. Trams not only shaped cities, they moulded the daily lives of the people who lived in them. In 1953, I was elected to the Auckland City Council and given a free annual tram pass. But like all the other councillors, I scarcely ever used it because by then, New Zealand towns had thoroughly accepted another mode of transport that was to have an even more profound effect than the electric tram. And in that year, 1953, the change was becoming very evident as towns and cities throughout the country prepared for the biggest royal occasion since 1901. Queen Elizabeth's first visit was also the first time New Zealanders had seen the reigning monarch here. Her Majesty moved about New Zealand towns not in a coach drawn by horses, but in a motor vehicle. The young Queen saw a country her grandparents had never seen. By now, a network of highways tied all towns together. Her Majesty could visit towns large and small from one end of the country to the other. The people who came to see her came into town by car. Schoolchildren assembled in their thousands, and they were brought from far-flung suburban schools on scores of buses. By mid-century, the motorcar had changed the face of town and country alike. But in the towns, other forces were already at work. As well as the post-war baby boom, immigration was accelerating the growth of population. New industries were taking root, and suburbs sprawled still further, far out into the countryside. One man, more than any other, can be identified with the changing face of our towns and cities. He got his start here in Dunedin. Like John Logan Campbell, that young man too was a Scot. When he came from Kirkintilloch to Dunedin, he was exactly the same age as Logan Campbell was when in 1840 he first explored the Waitemata. But there the resemblance ends. Unlike Dr. John Logan Campbell, the other young Scottish immigrant had no university education. He came instead, though, from a family that had building in its blood. Within a few months of arriving in 1909, he took up a contract to build a house here at Broad Bay on the shores of the Otago Peninsula. This is that house, and the name of the man who built it was James Fletcher. What set Fletcher apart was his enterprise and his willingness to risk the capital he borrowed. The next contract he chased was for a town hall, the Coronation Hall at St Kilda in Dunedin.
First number 5353. 89, all but 35, 35, 39, 39, on its own, number 2, 51, 51, 70, blind 70, 1414, all the fours, 44 on its own, number 5, 67, 67, 66, 7. House on 66.
This is that coronation hall. It was built in honour of the Duke and Duchess of Cornwall on the occasion of their coronation as King George V and Queen Mary. 70 years later, it's still used by the people of St Kilda. In fact, they use it almost every night of the week. And the Borough Council takes as much money in rent from housey evenings in 3 or 4 weeks as it paid Jim Fletcher back in 1911 to build a place. Fletcher was on his way. His staff and his operations both expanded. Although Dunedin had been New Zealand's busiest town in the 19th century, Fletcher realized that the towns of the future were in the north. Before he was 40, Fletcher had left landmarks in Featherston Street in Wellington, on the skyline of Auckland, and in almost every town and city in New Zealand. One job illustrates not only the risks that Fletcher was prepared to take, but also the significance of the role he played in building New Zealand cities. This choice Queen Street site became available in the 1920s when Fletcher completed the building of the new city markets on the waterfront. The talkies had come to the thriving picture theatre business, and although the Depression was looming, Fletcher contracted to build what is still the largest picture theatre in the country. The Depression deepened, but the job went ahead, and though Fletcher was never paid in full, he carried to completion the most spectacular building of its time in New Zealand. The Civic Theatre was the Fletcher Company's last fling before all major construction was halted by the Great Depression of the 1930s. And he wasn't the sort of man to be put off by adversity. He'd boundless faith in New Zealand's future, in its industry as well as its agriculture, in its urban promise as well as its rural prospects. As the Depression deepened, it brought a change of political persuasion. Jim Fletcher was just the man, practical and experienced, that the new political leaders badly needed. The Depression swept the Labour Party to power. Michael Joseph Sewage became Prime Minister. His principal supports were Peter Fraser, a Doer Scot who'd gone to jail for his principles, and Walter Nash, an Anglican lay preacher and former commercial traveller from Kidderminster. None of them had Fletcher's command of money, materials and management. So a new deal was struck. The Depression had meant that Fletcher had little to do once the Civic Theatre job was finished. He flooded the new government with proposals. His main idea was to rehouse the population. That suited the Labour government down to the ground. High-quality, low-rental state houses were to help keep them in office until the end of the following decade. State housing suburbs of the first Labour government are still distinctive landmarks from one end of New Zealand to the other. Little wonder that when the war demanded urgent projects, Labour made James Fletcher Commissioner of Defence Construction. The job gave him the power of a dictator, and he needed it. When the Americans arrived to establish bases for their operations in the Pacific, it was Fletcher who had to decide where and how their camps, hospitals and airstrips would be built. Throughout the war, no materials or manpower were allocated to either military or civilian construction without the ultimate approval of James Fletcher. wartime demands had underlined the shortage of building materials in New Zealand. In particular, it became clear that the country's supplies of native timbers were fast running out. These shortages reinforced in Fletcher's mind the inevitable importance of the exotic pine trees planted in the interior of the North Island as a relief measure during the Depression. He saw the potential of the timber not only for construction but also for making pulp and paper. What Fletcher had in mind, though, was getting for his company the contract to build the mill and the workers' accommodation. It was on Fletcher's urging that in 1951, Sid Holland's national government called worldwide tenders for the fast-maturing timber. But no overseas pulp and paper manufacturer responded. The trouble was the timber available was practically all Pinus radiata, and that pine from the coast of California had never been used for pulping before. No established company would have it on. So quite characteristically, Fletchers themselves decided to tender for the timber, and then they persuaded the New Zealand government to join them in establishing a New Zealand pulp and paper company. The Tasman Pulp and Paper Company's mill is the most impressive industrial landmark man has made in New Zealand. But before a mill of this size could be brought into operation, houses had to be built for its staff. So a town, an industrial town, designed for a very special purpose, was born here at Kawarau, beneath Mount Edgecombe. Because the plans were available, State House designs of the early 1950s were used. The chances are that today you own your own house and garden. If you do, the company probably made it possible. If you don't, you pay rent, not to the state, but to the company. A town built from scratch and virtually overnight can be built according to a plan. So, unlike many New Zealand towns, Kawarau is generously endowed with social amenities for young and old. But everything and everybody in Kawarau depends upon that mill. Like all other special purpose towns, its existence rests upon a single industrial foundation. If that industry fails, the whole town comes a cropper. Once upon a time, believe it or not, this was a thriving little town. The only trouble was that all its eggs were in one basket. For this was a special purpose coal mining town. Today, only one or two of the original mining families remain. The few people who live here are mainly recent arrivals, attracted by the cheap land and houses that the miners left behind. There's still coal here, though the town's gone. It's the town on the west coast of the South Island to which King Dick Seddon, the most famous of all New Zealand Prime Ministers, lent his name. He did so only after he'd been assured that Seddonville would be here forever. There used to be 20 or 30 mines amongst the bush-clad hills and a bustling population of miners and their families. The pubs never closed. The classrooms at Seddonville School were sometimes filled to overflowing. But now the school, like the mines, is silent. Trains don't come here anymore. The town's library wasn't the only building along this street. Here too, on both sides of the road, were most of its shops. The grocer and greengrocer, the baker, the barber and tobacconist, the boot and shoe repairer. And there were 3 pubs in town. But death and decay are the usual fate of towns that depend upon one commodity, on a commodity that, like gold, runs out, or that, like coal, is replaced by other forms of energy. The coal that's still in those hills will no doubt be extracted someday. But I can't imagine Seddonville itself coming to life again. Fortunately, though, special purpose towns, towns that depend upon one resource, one industry, one function, are unusual in New Zealand. The typical New Zealand town is very different from Seddonville, even in its prime. The typical New Zealand town is not a mining town, an industrial town, or a timber town. It's a farmer's town. Its roots spread wide and reach deep into the soil of a rural hinterland. Farmers don't live in farmers' towns. Their homes are on the land. But like Bill Simpson, they go to town, these days at least once a week. Mail, telephone, and most of all roads provide the network that ties every farm to an urban centre. Farmers' towns are found throughout New Zealand. They all justify the name Kiwi town. Each has its own clearly defined farming community, its own distinctive hinterland. But what the towns have in common are the functions they perform on behalf of the farmer and their uniformity of layout and appearance. The outskirts of Kiwi town are signalled by freezing works or dairy factory. It's heralded by the veterinary clinic and the second-hand farm machinery depot. On almost every corner there's a motor garage, replacing the blacksmith shop of yesteryear. Kiwi town sits astride a main street that's straight and wide enough to turn a bullock team around in. In the middle of Main Street, as well as on either side, parking meters have replaced hitching rails. Wherever you go in New Zealand, you pass through towns that look just like this. Downtown buildings have only 1 or 2 stories, and almost without interruption, verandas shelter and shade the footpaths. Beneath the verandas is the familiar range of retail shops. Upstairs, where there is a second story, are the offices of lawyers and accountants and of doctors and dentists. The weekly trip to town that Bill and Judy Simpson make is part of the routine on every farm.
I'll see you later, Righteous. Okay.
Bill Simpson pops in first to see his accountant. But the traditional reason for the farmer's trip to town is elsewhere.
10, 19, 90 bit 90, quarter, 10, 10, 20, 90, 20, hold on to 90, 20, 30, getting down, 19, 30, quarter, hold on to 19, 30, we cash up. Wait for them, the $18 for them, 19 for them, 17 to go, come on, 17 the lower, 16 to start, 16 look at 10, oh, 16, 10, I got 16, 10, 16, 10, 20, 21, 30, 30.
This is what provides us with the best idea of what Kiwi Town, any Kiwi Town, is all about. Kiwi Town's where farmers come to buy and to sell. Here at the sale yards, they do it in the open by public auction where everybody can see what's going on. But like Bill Simpson, a lot of the farmers here do even more business selling grain and grass and clover seed by private negotiation with the merchants of Kiwi Town. Especially here, for this Kiwi Town, is Oamaru in North Otago, the southernmost corner of the granary of New Zealand. Oamaru is older than most other Kiwi towns and larger, and it's a port, although not a major one. In all other respects, the functions it performs make it the perfect model of Kiwi Town. But the solid white buildings, constructed in the 1880s of Oamaru stone, lend it a dignity and maturity lacking in many a North Island Kiwi town.
There you go, Bill. Thank you very much, Ian. That's good service. You going to John next year tonight? Yep. Let's go. We'll see you there.
At the heart of Kiwi Town's commerce are the stock and station agents. They grew up by lending the farmer money to buy and to develop his land. But now they handle nearly all he buys and sells in running his farm, furnishing his home, and providing for his family. Though stock and station agents service a far-flung community of farmers, their premises are in town, and that's where their employees live too. Every New Zealand town has at least one or two stock and station agents. Oamaru more than most because of the diversity of products of North Otago's mixed farming. Here and elsewhere, though, in recent years the smaller ones have gone. They've been gobbled up by the larger firms. The largest of them all has its headquarters in Wellington. Finally, in fact, every enterprise and every town in the country looks to Wellington. Wellington replaced Auckland as capital in 1865. And because of its central location was immediately more effective than Auckland could ever have been. In recent years, it's acquired the skyline of a metropolis. But despite its urban appearance, its roots reach back through the other main centres and the multitude of Kiwi towns like Oamaru to the farms and soil of the countryside. Apart from one very specialised function that only one city in any country can have, Wellington's no more than Kiwi Town HQ, 31 stories high. To get anything done in New Zealand, sooner or later, you've got to come here. The special function that alone makes Wellington distinctive is housed today in this building. The beehive is both the heart and the hub of the nation. I came here to Parliament myself more than once in the late 1940s, 1950s, not in my own interest, but in Auckland's. First time I came with a man who's since proved to be perhaps the most outstanding figure in the history of local body politics in New Zealand. We were taken to a room rather like this one and shown into seats back against the wall. Then we were called up to the table one by one to present our evidence. We'd come to make submissions to a group of what then seemed to me to be quite elderly gentlemen, the members of the Local Bills Committee of the House. It took the man I was with until late into the night to submit his customarily quite lengthy submissions.
Mr. Chairman, I think I've said enough. It's just on midnight. We've had a long day. We've been here since 9 o'clock this morning. And I think I've said enough to convince you and any honest people that the whole of this scheme is fraudulent.
That man was Robbie, now Sir Dove-Myer Robinson. What he was so worried about was a proposal to dump Auckland's sewerage raw into the Waitemata harbour opposite the waterfront suburb of Glendowie, where he lived. No city can exist, let alone grow, without the efficient disposal of its sewerage. During and after the war, Auckland's sewerage disposal system was not only inefficient, it was hopelessly overloaded. Most of the human waste from Auckland was piped to this pumping station here at Auraki. It was a foul, evil-smelling place, I know, because when I became a member of the Drainage Board, I had to go in there on a tour of inspection. And then the sewerage was held in tanks beneath the road and the pavement here until high tide. At high tide, virtually untreated sewerage was taken from those holding tanks under the road and simply discharged into the harbour. It was so dense it used to flatten the waves out there, and that was only a couple of kilometres from the heart of town. If you ignored the warnings, and even if you merely went for a swim in the Waitemata, you ran the risk of typhoid fever. Worse than that, some of the newest parts of Auckland weren't linked up even to the outdated Auraki system. They still depended on the night cart method of the previous century. What Robbie and I were fighting against was the Drainage Board's belated proposals. It was going to pipe that sewerage from the station at Auraki to Glendowie here, and from here to, of all places, Browns Island. And on Browns Island, the sewerage was to be screened and sedimented and discharged once again into the Waitemata. It would hardly have been any improvement on what had gone before. Robbie campaigned tirelessly for years until we realized that the only way to prevent the Waitemata from being polluted forever was to get ourselves elected to the Auckland City Council, because the Auckland City Council appointed a majority of the members of the Drainage Board. In 1953, just a few weeks before that royal tour, we got ourselves elected to the City Council, enough of us to make sure we were appointed to the Drainage Board. Cartoonists had a field day, wondering what on earth we'd be able to do. A multi-million-pound contract to take the sewerage from Iraqi to Browns Island had already been let, but we cancelled it. Work came to a stop. We brought in a hand-picked panel of overseas experts to recommend an alternative scheme. They came up with a plan that was radically different. It was to take Auckland's domestic sewerage away from the front door on the Waitemata and to discharge it into Auckland's other harbour at the back door, the Manukau. On its way, the system would pick up the trade wastes from Auckland's freezing works and other noxious industries around the shore of one of the arms of the Manukau. But the crucial difference was that the city's sewerage was now to be purified in a series of oxidation ponds before it was discharged. The scheme was remarkably similar to the solution Robbie had advocated all along. The final discharge from here into the Manukau harbour is so pure that I've seen Sir Dove-Myer Robinson, who was chairman of the board when these works were being constructed and 5 times mayor of Auckland, actually drink it. With such an efficient sewerage system, Auckland was now again free to resume its growth. But this time it was not the electric tram that defined its shape and outline, but the motor vehicle. The irony is that Aucklanders didn't start to worry about the excessive growth of their city until the mid-1970s. But by then, its spectacular growth had virtually come to an end. The dominance of the motor car in shaping our towns and cities was being undermined by the rocketing price of fuel. Very soon, the fastest growing movement on Auckland streets was a reaction against the motor vehicle and against living in large cities. The biggest run for fun in the world, along the shores of the Waitemata. It's a return, in a sense, to the spirit and style of John Logan Campbell's Walk to Work Auckland. Offshore, the sparkle of the Waitemata has returned too. And Browns Island itself, thank goodness, has been preserved almost as it was in 1840. Here on Browns Island, John Logan Campbell sat and waited for the city of Auckland to be established, and he dreamt of the multiracial metropolis to be. Logan Campbell lived through all the first 70 years of Auckland's development until 1912. Only 2 years after that, a Sheffield schoolboy arrived in Auckland, and now Sir Dove-Myer Robinson has been here almost as long as Sir John Logan Campbell was. And he's seen that pioneer's dream come true. The whole story of Auckland, and for that matter of all New Zealand towns and cities, is encompassed by the lives of those two most remarkable men. Our cities are still very young. Could they, though, perhaps be coming already close to the limits of their growth? I wonder if mayors and councillors of tomorrow will ever be able to contemplate the kind of growth that Robbie and I watched and indeed had a hand in. What do you think, Robbie?
Well, I think that our predecessors made many modifications in the structure of the city, the physical appearance, but I don't think that we should criticize them because they could have done far worse than they have done. It's a materialistic city, it's a great big sprawling city. It's a city of merchants. People are more interested